the recourse we have now. The trial judge can impose a higher sentence, a stricter sentence for young offenders who commit violent crimes. It's only 4% of young offenders who commit violent crimes. You are trying to create the impression of a youth crime crisis, but that's not true. The level of crime with young offenders has decreased over the past 7 years. You are fear-mongering. It's not true.
Thank you, Ms. May. Stéphane Dion. Crime is dropping in Canada every year because we have an approach which takes everything into account. Yes, tougher sentences when the law is broken, but you also have to deal with the problem of poverty, deal with housing. We also have to look at the victims. What's dangerous is that Canada really might make a wrong choice. We need a liberal government, otherwise we'll have a conservative government which will import from the United States American solutions, which even the Americans don't want. A very high incarceration rate, not just for children but also for adults, and with a repeat offender rate which is very high. And as a result, our communities will not be any safer.
Clarify something. Mr. Harper, are you saying that even if you still had a minority government, you'd be prepared to move with a confidence vote on this young offenders
as I said,
bill?
I won't predict the result of this election. Obviously,
but you're saying that you'd be willing to make this a confidence
platform, and it's our intention to govern according to our mandate. There are two things in terms of young offenders that we need to keep in mind. Obviously, tougher sentences in the case of very violent and extreme crimes, and also new investments. I announced an investment of some $50 million for prevention programs for youth at risk. We've already invested in these programs that work well, and we need to continue with a balanced approach. We need dissuasion, but we also need prevention.
But Mr. Layton, for example, if there was a minority government that introduced this bill on young offenders, after the election, would you defeat this government?
If it was a bad piece of legislation, yes. The answer is yes. Because we are a party of principle. We are going to...
Is that true for your colleagues around the table?
Not, because I agree with Harper. But we need a debate on the substance. In other words, do we have a better model for tackling crime and improving people's safety than the U.S. model? For example, house arrests for serious crimes. Well, he wants to abolish them. He doesn't want the judge to have that leeway. According to the Conservatives themselves, that means 7,000 more Canadians in prison. We don't have enough prisons. These are provincial prisons. So the provinces, with this kind of plan, would have to invest $2 billion in prisons rather than education, rather than the environment, rather than police forces, other measures which could help to have a fairer society. That's the mistake they made in U.S. states. They realized that. Let's not repeat it here in Canada with Mr. Harper.
Mr. Harper, you said that you would spend $50 million on youth. That $50 million are for big companies. You promised that last time, and you didn't do it. No, you spoke of $5 million last time.
We've already invested in these programs. We've strengthened our investments.
No, you did not make the major investments in young people, and we have to do that. Otherwise, we can't prevent crime.
In order, Mr. Giuseppe and Ms. May.
Two basic debates, fundamental debates here. What Mr. Harper's proposing is U.S.-style justice, and we know the results, whereas in Quebec, that's the province, the area with the least violence in North America, because we've balanced our efforts against, strong efforts against anti-gang and a more flexible approach with young people. Now, you said that if the bill was okay, you'd support it. If it was bad, you'd oppose it. But we've seen what happened. What Mr. Harper has just said is that if he gets elected, then he's in the minority now, and in the past he should have accepted the will of the majority represented by the opposition parties in the House. But he passed legislation and then he violated it himself. He said that there would be fixed election dates and he wouldn't be able to call, a prime minister would no longer be able to call an election for partisan reasons, and now that's exactly what he's done. So he said it's immoral not to respect the will of the majority. Why doesn't he do that?
I find it quite ironic that Mr. Harper is talking about crime, and yet he himself ignored legislation on Kyoto, ignored legislation on fixed date elections, and ignored legislation on the Atlantic Accord. He decides which legislation he likes and which he doesn't like, and that's not a good example.
Well, I agree with Mr. Duceppe, but the only difference is that don't think that in other parts of the country you can also have this approach. For example, in Regina, we have as a Liberal candidate the Chief of Police of Regina, who's reduced crime by 25% by using this kind of model. They identified the leaders of street gangs rather than just putting everybody in prison. And they want this Liberal approach for the country as a whole. And we, Quebecers in Canada, we can have a positive influence when we work with other Canadians, and this is what we can do in our party. But we don't have legislative power all across the country. We've only got it at the federal level.